Okay, guys, today we're going to talk about long-term and short-term changes in environments and how that affects the populations of organisms and their adaptations. So, we already know that organisms adapt to changes in their environments, and we know that over long periods of time, organisms change and adapt to best survive in the environments that they live in. The changes can be behavioral or structural. We already know that organisms that cannot adapt to their environments generally either die or migrate. When an environment changes, the acronym MAD helps us understand what organisms do to survive. They migrate, adapt, or die. So the topic for this week is to understand how changes in the environment can be either short-term or long-term, and how those different changes can lead to adaptations or changes in subsequent populations of living things. Now, when I say subsequent populations, I mean many generations down the road. Remember, evolution is a very slow process, and it doesn't happen in 1 or 2 or even 10 generations. So first, let's talk about the two types of changes. So ecosystem changes can be either short-term or long-term. Short-term changes happen quickly and long-term changes happen over time. And then here is a picture of adaptation that kind of explains how an organism who cannot adapt, such as the second and third giraffes, are unable to get food. Oops. Oh, goodness. All right, so short-term changes. Short-term changes happen quickly. They're unexpected and sudden, and they don't give organisms the time or the chance to change or adapt. These types of changes can include natural disasters, such as fires, floods, or hurricanes. Also things like blizzards, mudslides, that kind of thing. They don't impact the ecosystem for long or permanently, maybe a few years or even less, a few weeks. In such cases, the plants and animals that live in that ecosystem, they don't need to adapt to the change since the change is not permanent and does not last. Now, some of the organisms may die in the disaster or the change, and then some may survive and some may escape. Either way, the subsequent populations of organisms will not have new adaptations to those changes because it was a short-term change. Subsequent populations do not need to adapt to that change in order to survive, since it is a short-term, not long-lasting change. Long-term changes are different. They happen slowly over time. They're more gradual. Things like climate change, pollution, deforestation, or urbanization. Urbanization means building cities. So when we start building cities in nature, over time, the nature, of course, is going to be changed, and that change is going to last a lot longer. Over time, the ecosystem changes, and this change can be permanent or last a very long time, like hundreds of years. The plants and animals that live in those ecosystems have to change in order to survive in these new conditions. For example, if climate change causes an ecosystem to become colder and colder over many decades, then each subsequent generation of organisms would need to have adaptations to help them survive these conditions. If they're unable to adapt, remember their other two choices are migrate or die. The organisms that do adapt don't die and they survive. When the changes are long-term, the result will be genetic variation between the original and new populations of the species. The new subsequent populations will have new traits that will help them survive the new changed environment. And remember, again, this happens very slowly, and it can take many, many decades and many generations for those subsequent traits to appear. Here's a quick Venn diagram that explains the differences between the short-term and long-term changes, as well as some similarities between them. So we already talked about how short-term changes happen quickly and long-term changes happen slowly. We talked about how in a short-term change, organisms are going to migrate or die. and how in a long-term change, organisms are going to adapt. If they cannot adapt, then they die. Ecosystem is not permanently changed here, but here, ecosystem is permanently changed. Okay, some things that you need to know that can be both. So here in the center, we have that both types of changes can be natural, like weather, or they can be human caused, like pollution or urbanization. And both of them can cause changes in the organisms, but genetic variation and adaptation will only occur with long-term changes. All right, I hope that helps you guys better understand this topic.